Hello everybody and welcome to another amazing video of DIY investing. For today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys an exact blueprint for how to map out this cycle, how to invest over the next couple years, and we're going to be talking about not only 4-year cycles, but we're also going to be talking about a left translated cycle where we actually end up topping early. This is something that we've talked a little bit about recently, but now I'm going to be actually mapping out exactly what the price could look like if that happens and how we can go about investing and preparing for either scenario so that we can ultimately make the most profit possible over the next few years. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and with that being said, let's jump right into this amazing video today. Alrighty guys, so here we are to start off today's video, and we're going to go all the way back basically since the beginning of Bitcoin. Now, a lot of this is going to go over the 4-year cycle, but we're also going to be mapping out specifically what could play out if we end up getting an early cycle top, because there's going to become an inevitable end to Bitcoin and crypto where they no longer start going up, where there's something that happens in the economies. Maybe it's another black swan. Who knows exactly? It's probably going to be the collapse of the dollar would be my guess, but we don't know exactly what the heck is going to happen, and it's everybody's best guess that eventually there's going to become a point where Bitcoin becomes massively adopted, or eventually these early cycles, these very parabolic bull runs that we've seen up to this point eventually just stop. So let's talk about what the heck that's going to look like. So first things first, let's go through and analyze the cycle low of every single one of our bear market bottoms, and we're going to be going through each and every one of them. Now, we're even going to be factoring in this very first cycle. Even though it's slightly shortened, I still feel like it's important that we talk about it, just because Bitcoin is so symmetrical with all of this. Now, up to this point, we talked a little bit about this in the last video. What we see inside of a Bitcoin cycle, so from bottom to bottom, that's the way you're going to measure a full cycle, and the time in between should equal 4 years, and that's what we've seen up to this point. This one was about 3.2 years, so almost 4 years, but keep in mind that at this time, Bitcoin didn't have hardly any money in it, so it makes sense why it was slightly shortened. There wasn't much liquidity. Then we go from this cycle low to this cycle low, and this completes our next 4-year cycle. This was almost exactly 4 years, being 1,428 days. Then we go for this next one here, and we just completed it with our FTX collapse that happened November of 2022. And that was the exact same distance from the cycle in 2015-2018. So it's really amazing how symmetrical Bitcoin actually is with this setup. We see this 4-year cycle play out continuously over the last few years, really since 2011. And, you know, at this time Bitcoin was nothing, so it's hard to really factor any sort of weight inside of that. But once we started syncing up with all of this, it's really a beautiful thing. This bottom took place in November at the end of the year. This bottom took place in January at the end of the year. This bottom took place at December at the end of the year, and this bottom took place at November at the end of the year. So we see the exact same correlation each and every one of our cycles. That's why you'd have to be a fool to actually, bet against this trend. But all good things have to come to an end, and so there will be an inevitable time where Bitcoin stops following these 4-year cycles. We've talked about this, but up to this point it hasn't, and we need to continue to stick to these and then at least talk about the scenario where what happens if this is the cycle where it actually does stop following that. Now, here's the thing, guys. If we're talking about 4-year cycles, we also have to talk about left and right translations, because this is the way that we're going to be able to dictate whether this cycle is going to be shortened or whether it's going to be a normal one. Now, the way that we would do that is by analyzing the midway point of a 4-year cycle. So that would be 725 days if you're calculating based off of 1,450 days. So we're going to go with 728 because that's the closest I can get on the weekly. And we can see that the way that the price topped, we can see that this is the left side of the midway point, and this is the right side of the midway point, right? Now, we can see that we actually topped right barely on this right side, but we also keep in mind that this was only 3.2 years worth of a 4-year cycle, so it wasn't even a true 4-year cycle, and we still ended up topping to this right side. This was a right translated cycle, and that's what we would know a right or a left translated cycle. Whatever the cycle tops at, whatever side of the midway point the cycle tops at, that is the way that you would gauge whether it's a right or left translation. So that we can see inside of our very first cycle here, completed 4-year cycle, this was a right translated cycle based off of our cycle top happening on the right side at the midway point. Now we get into this next cycle right here. Now inside of this next cycle, this one followed a much more closer time frame to what we'd be looking for. And so if we come over here and we draw 725 days, basically the same thing being 28, we can see that the price, this is the midway point, the price topped on the right side of this midway point. That was where our cycle topped in 2017. So once again, this was a right translated cycle. So in the same way that this was a right translation at the top of the cycle, the same way is going to be, most likely we continue to follow that same 4-year trend, to which we have, once again, if we measure the bottom here, we get another completed 4-year cycle. But then if we measure 725 days from the cycle low that we experienced December of 2018, draw another midway point, we can see that the price also once again topped on the right side of the midway point. So every single one of these cycles has been a right translated cycle. And up to this point, every single cycle has also been a 4-year cycle. This one was slightly shorter, being it was only 3.2 years long, but, still the same thing. We still had the same following rules all the way through. So up to this point, every one of our cycles has been the same. And so as we're inside of this current bull run, we just had the completion of a 4-year cycle and the beginning of a new one. Now the question is, are we going to continue to follow another 4-year cycle like all of these other ones have? Is it going to be another right translated cycle? Or are we going to end up getting a little bit of variance inside of this one? And what could potentially that look like? Well, right off the bat, the best way to gauge this is to go from the bottom of this cycle to the bottom of the next cycle, or just, roughly project 1,450 days, because that's going to give us, the range of where our cycle is going to be falling into. Now, we also want to be analyzing the midway point of this range as well, being 725 days. 728 because we're on a weekly time scale. So this is going to be what our cycle looks like, and this is going to be the path that we follow. So now the question is, are we going to get a right translated cycle where we top on the right side of the midway range, or are we going to end up seeing a left translated cycle where it tops on this left side? If we see a left translation, in my opinion, we have a couple scenarios here. Scenario one being where we end up making, kind of an echo cycle, I would say, where our cycle ends up running maybe similar to what we saw over here inside of 2019, this very first little run up. At the time, this was the very biggest run that we had ever seen inside of Bitcoin, and still really is. Out of a bear market bottom, we had never seen quite this expanse in Bitcoin's price. And so, in that same kind of way that we had this consolidation, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something, a little bit similar, where maybe we make this big run up and we go into new all-time highs, and this cycle ends up being a little bit more like a blow-off top scenario, and we end up front-running quite a bit, way before our halving, way before anything else, because we haven't seen that up to this point. It's taken a good margin before we actually get to the point of breaking all-time highs. If we come over here and look at this cycle, to the point of breaking all-time highs, we're looking at a little over 3 years right there. If we look at this cycle here, it was once again sitting there at about 3 years before we broke out. So if we start breaking out, front running, into a year into this cycle, or even if it drags on and takes a lot longer, sorry if this looks a little bit ugly and it's hard to see, regardless, it doesn't really change a whole lot. What we're looking for is a cycle top happening on the left side of the midway range. And so I think one scenario is this scenario where we kind of get this big move into price discovery, and it doesn't even have to go that high in price. Right here is about 150,000 to 200,000. I think that that's a reasonable price given another bull run. But keep in mind, it could top shorter. Maybe it takes all this time to creep all this way up here, and maybe we only get slightly above the all-time highs, if getting above them at all. If we end up topping inside of a left translation, we would then begin the inverse of a 4-year cycle, where we would actually start 3 years down and 1 year up. Because keep in mind, guys, up to this point, every bull run has been this. We see 3 years up, right there, 1,064, and then we see 1 year down. 364 days. And that's been the case every single one of these cycles. And so if we end up topping in a left translation, the inverse of what all of these have done up to this point, then at that point we're going to expect to see the inverse of a 4-year cycle. It would be a bearish 4-year cycle. At that point, if we end up topping and then we start a new bear market, we would expect that we're going to continue to follow that same bearish trend. But instead of it only lasting a year like prior bear markets have, a top sometime at the end of the year, we'd be looking at this multi-year process of us kind of grinding out. And there would be periods of us going up, but like I stated, it would be 3 years down and then 1 year's up. So it would be the inverse of all of that. And so we would still have a whole nother drop to go after that point as well. So it's something to keep in note. It's something to at least acknowledge here, because there will be a point where Bitcoin does top from these cycles. There will be a point. We know that. Nothing can just go up forever. And so I think that with crypto specifically, there will be this point where the cycles end up topping and we front run. Maybe we end up making an early cycle top where we have this blow off top like this is kind of drawn here. Or maybe we have a lot of turmoil inside of the world. We just grind out all the way throughout here, maybe make a slow climb over the next, year and a half, 2, 3 years up to those all-time highs before then starting that bear market all the way back down again. It's something that we need to be aware of, because there's so many different scenarios that can truly play out given this entire cycle. If we were to have a lot of turmoil inside of the world and we were to have this 4-year cycle, maybe the 4-year cycle literally takes all of this time to get over here to this right translation, but we don't really ever end up making a new all-time high. It's more of this long, slow build up, and then we start another 1-year decline back down. These are scenarios that can happen all the way through. We don't have to have brand new all-time highs like every single bull run before us. We always expect that because that's what we've been given up to this point. I still believe that that's what's going to happen, but I'm giving you guys all the scenarios so that we can best be prepared. If we end up seeing a left translation, it would mark an inevitable end of the Bitcoin cycles and the bull runs, to which we would suffer a bearish alternative to the downside. However, even if we end up topping to the right translation, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have massive price discovery like this scenario draws. We could get this right translation, we could get right over here on this right side, but then we also are just sitting right at those prior all-time highs or somewhere inside of this range at around 48K, and it's just this long, slow process with there being a ton of stuff happening inside of the world that's just prohibiting Bitcoin from being able to see true upside. There's scenarios that we need to see fit. We're not always going to be guaranteed these massive bull runs, and there will be a point in which they do stop. When is that going to be? I don't know. I think that we are going to be fortunate enough to see another brand new bull run, another 3-year bull run, another right translated cycle, and then it would be my guess that after this next bull run, we actually would see a left translated cycle after that. That would be the ultimate blessing, because obviously we'd get a whole nother 4-year cycle bull run to profit off of over the next 3 years. So it would be phenomenal to have that, obviously. But if we are so blessed to see another 4-year cycle, and then, in my opinion, there's so much that's happening in adoption-wise that there's only so much more that we can go up from there. And with what's happening inside of the dollar, all the weakening inside of the American economy as well, I think that there is going to be a point where we have to go through some shaky turmoil inside of the world as a whole. So when that happens, all of that volatility that plays out, it's going to be interesting to see the way Bitcoin plays out. But this is just what I wanted to give you guys a blueprint and an idea of how to understand what these 4-year cycles are going to be looking like. So one other thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about is Ethereum. Ethereum is going to be the staple of altcoins. So it's important that we talk about it, because here's the thing with Ethereum. When we're talking about Bitcoin, we're going to also be talking about what the altcoins are going to be doing over the course of the cycle. Whatever Ethereum is doing is what is going to be pointing to the direction of altcoins as well. When Ethereum is outperforming, altcoins as a whole are doing well, and they're outperforming Bitcoin. Now, what we're seeing up to this point inside of Ethereum, I've heard a lot of people compare to the same consolidation and bottom formation that we saw in our last bear market, which, if you guys don't know what this black outline is, it's literally this bottom formation right here, and it was the first leg up. I've seen a lot of people comparing how our current bottom formation looks like that, and I would have to agree. There is a lot of similarities here when we're actually comparing both of these charts, but there is some differences as well. The biggest one being the time that we've spent inside of this consolidation. We're currently sitting at just under 300 days that we've been inside of this bottom, and that's a lot longer. In fact, it's significantly longer than what we saw over here back in our last bear market. This entire move was probably about half that, I would say, looking at about 190 days. just for the entire run up, and we haven't even seen that entire move. And so that's kind of what we're talking about inside of this bottom. And I do believe that this is very, very similar, and it should play out in a similar fashion. The difference being, I think that this is going to be a bigger move off of the lows. I think that Ethereum is going to get a move all the way up to about 3,500, which I believe is going to be the 618 of this entire consolidation. Yeah, so it would be the 618 right up here. And that's kind of where I think that Ethereum is going to be running up in the short term. And I do believe it's going to catch a lot of people off guard when that happens. I do say that there's going to be a big altcoin run in this cycle because we didn't really see that inside of our last one. There was nothing really like what we saw even in 2017. And I've talked a lot about that with you guys because most of people weren't around that long to even remember what the heck it was like. And they weren't really watching these charts and comparing it. And so when we're comparing our last cycle to what we've seen, or at least what I've seen in prior cycles, it wasn't anything as parabolic. You know, Ethereum did its thing. There were certain narratives that played out like DeFi and NFTs, but as a whole, it wasn't anything like what we saw with just everything kind of going up in a euphoric nature being 2017. One thing we're looking at here with Ethereum is the Bitcoin pair. And this is one of the things that gives me a reason why our current cycle has a big opportunity of playing out like 2017 did. Now, if we're comparing our last cycle to what we saw in 2017, all of the altcoins against their Bitcoin ratios were going into price discovery, right? This was when Ethereum was making that massive move in 2017. Throughout that entire time, it was in price discovery against Bitcoin. And that's where we saw Bitcoin and Ethereum almost match the same market cap for a short while. If we're comparing that bull run to what we saw in our last bull run, this last bull run didn't even break all-time highs, right? We creeped up here, but we were still quite a ways below. We probably hit about the 618 of that move up. We didn't even hit that. We hit the 0.5 fib. So it wasn't even nearly as big as what we would have expected to see. But that's why I argue that the reason why it wasn't as big has everything to do with the fact that where we're at in the timing of the cycle. I believe this entire first leg up was just the build up and the foundation leading into the parabolic phase that we're going to be expecting to see inside of this cycle. And that's kind of what the charts have been telling me. Now, inside of this most recent move for Ethereum, we just finished an impulse, and in my opinion, we finished a correction as well. And this thing's going to start outperforming Bitcoin. And so as a whole, we would expect to see altcoins actually start outperforming Bitcoin as well. So when we're looking at this entire move was just a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 up, and we just finished an ABC correction back down to the Fibonacci of the 618. And so that's the level that we were expecting to see, right back down on a trending support. And so now that we finished this move, in my opinion, we should expect to see altcoins continue to outperform from here with Ethereum. And that's why I think that where we're looking at Ethereum's price, this bottom structure definitely looks like it could take off and run up to this $3,500 level and hit that 618 Fibonacci. This is something I'm going to be watching for. I think that this cycle specifically, altcoins have a very real opportunity of seeing a lot of upside potential against ETH. In the same way that when we're looking at Ethereum against Bitcoin, like I stated, I think that our entire last cycle was just a build-up. And so this cycle is going to be the one where we finally start going into price discovery, right? Where we finally start making these type of moves. And that's where a lot of people aren't going to be expecting it, just like they weren't in 2019. But we have a huge opportunity to be able to capitalize on that move when it takes place. And for me personally, I think that we could see Ethereum sitting at a 0.3 ratio against Bitcoin and actually see it at least temporarily flip Bitcoin and market cap. A lot of people are going to speculate against me on that, but for me personally, I think that's going to happen. I think that altcoins are at a point where we're going to have a lot of retail adoption that takes place, where similar to what we saw in 2017, but on a much greater scale. And so during those times, with everything that we've seen with Ethereum up to this point, with so much adoption that takes place inside of Ethereum, I kind of feel like it's inevitable, but we're going to see, and I'm just going to be speculating on that. I'd like to hear what you guys actually think about that. One final chart before we wrap up today's video. This is going to be mapping out the entirety of all of the Bitcoin dominance, and this is really going to be explaining why I believe altcoins are setting themselves up for a much greater cycle, especially when comparing it to our last bull run. Now, the reason why 2017 was so powerful was because Bitcoin dominance was falling and altcoins were taking up market share against Bitcoin as they went into price discovery. That's why we saw Ethereum against its Bitcoin ratio, which I don't have it pulled up anymore, but that's why we saw Ethereum against its Bitcoin ratio going up like crazy, and for the short term in 2017 getting very close to flipping Bitcoin in market cap. Now in our last cycle, we did see an altcoin run, but it wasn't anything close to that. This was 2017, this was our 2018 bear market, and then this entire move from basically here, because technically we made a new high on this move up right here. And it was right inside of this leg that we actually ended up seeing that alt season. And it was only this entire move here inside of this green circle that we ended up seeing that move. And so it was nothing in comparison to what we saw in 2017. This was a much greater move. And so that's why I tell you guys that when we're comparing our cycles, we can't expect that this coming cycle is going to be exactly the same as our last one, just because of the fact that's the most recent one in our minds. In our last cycle, it was very lackluster, and the reason why I believe that was because this is just the build-up before we finally go into price discovery against Bitcoin dominance. So Bitcoin dominance will fall, altcoins will once again steal market share, and that will fuel this coming bull run. And so I mapped out altcoin cycles, Bitcoin cycles. We talked about left and right translations, and the reason why is because if we're going to have a normal 4-year bull run and it's a right translated cycle, we would expect to have a cycle top being the end of the year 2025. And so that would be our next projected cycle top. That's what we're going to be expecting to see. And so inside of this following cycle, I talked about why I believe the next cycle after that could actually be a right translation, where we end up front running, we end up topping early, we end up making some type of multi bull run cycle top that leads into a multi-year bear market decline. And so I think that this chart is also explaining the same thing, because this next bull run is going to be going into price discovery. We're going to be breaking all-time lows, because this was 2017. This was the all-time low that Bitcoin dominance ever hit. This was the all-time low the Bitcoin dominance hit in our last bull run. We held a higher high above that move. And so I believe when we finally break below that all-time low of 2017 and go into price discovery, we have a huge opportunity of being able to capitalize on that. And that's why when we're coming over here and we're actually taking a look at Ethereum against its Bitcoin ratio, and we just see all of this accumulation that has taken place over the last few years, this is going to produce some type of major market cycle, and that's exactly what the Bitcoin dominance is telling us. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be playing. I wanted to give you guys this update as a way to more or less clarify some thoughts, talk about the way that we can prepare. The best way to prepare is to understand different scenarios, and this is going to give you guys an idea of what the left and right translations are, how to be able to prepare for either of those scenarios, depending on what the market actually ends up taking footing of. So I'm going to give you guys updates. I'm going to continue to stick to the way that I make these videos. Obviously, you guys know that. If you guys found value in this, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd like to hear you guys' opinions on what you experienced inside of this video, whether you differ on anything. I'd like to hear the way that you guys actually think about these cycles and how you think that this cycle could actually play out given a full 4-year trend, or maybe a shortened one. Who knows? Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you guys wanted to join the Discord server, download my free ebook, links are in the description for that. You guys can also sign up for my VIP group where I post all my trades, all my investments, anything that I'm doing inside of the market with my money. Links are in the description to go ahead and do that as well. Thank you all so much for the support. And with that being said, I will catch you in the next one. As always, peace out.